On my 80th birthday, I never imagined my son would force me into a car and tell the driver, take her out of town. This is her last birthday. But the biggest shock was yet to come. When the car stopped, I realized who the driver was. Margaret woke up and the first thing she thought was, great, another year closer to being completely invisible. 80 today. Harold used to joke she'd live to 100 just to spite everyone, but Harold wasn't here to crack jokes anymore. Her apartment felt bigger every morning, like the walls were slowly backing away from her. She made coffee with shaky hands. When did her hands start shaking? Yesterday? Last year? Time moved weird when you got old. Some days felt like decades, others flashed by like you'd blinked. The coffee tasted like cardboard, but she drank it anyway because what else was she gonna do? Complain to the cat she didn't have? Harold used to make her birthday pancakes that looked like abstract art and tasted worse. She'd pretend they were delicious because he'd get that proud little smile, like he'd just painted the Sistine Chapel instead of burning breakfast. God, she missed those awful pancakes. The doorbell rang around 10, which surprised her because Mrs. Martinez usually came by around noon with gossip about the Hendersons in 4B. But it was David, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else, with Linda trailing behind him like a guilty shadow. Happy birthday, Mom. David's voice had that fake, cheerful tone he used when he was about to ask for money. Something was definitely wrong. David never visited without calling first, Linda's rule, probably. And Linda looked like she was about to throw up, which wasn't exactly the birthday energy Margaret was hoping for. You look terrible, Margaret told her son, because at 80 you earned the right to be blunt. What's wrong? Did you lose the house? Are you getting divorced? Is someone dead? Nobody's dead, Mom. David laughed, but it sounded like broken glass. We have a surprise for you. Margaret's stomach dropped. In her experience, surprises at her age usually involved legal documents or medical procedures. What kind of surprise? The good kind. Get your coat, we're going for a drive. Linda was staring at her shoes like they might suddenly develop the ability to speak. Margaret had seen that look before. It was the same expression Linda wore when she'd accidentally backed into their neighbor's fence and hadn't told David yet. I don't like drives, Margaret lied. She actually loved drives, but something about this whole situation felt wrong, like when you smell gas but can't find the leak. The elevator was one of those awkward metal boxes where nobody talks and everyone stares at the numbers like they're solving calculus. David kept making that clicking sound with his tongue, something he'd done since he was 5 and nervous about something. Margaret studied her son's profile. When had he gotten so many gray hairs? When had those worry lines carved themselves around his eyes? She'd been so busy being old, she'd missed him getting middle-aged. David, you're scaring me. There's nothing to be scared of, Mom. But his voice did that thing it used to do when he was 16 and trying to convince her he hadn't been drinking at Tommy Kowalski's party. Some things never changed, even when your kid was pushing 50. Outside, there was a black car waiting, not David's usual beat-up truck, but something sleek and expensive-looking that probably cost more than Margaret's rent. Whose car is that? Just trust me, okay? Trust. Ha. Margaret had learned not to trust surprise car rides around the time her cousin Eddie had driven their grandmother to what he claimed was a nice lunch, but turned out to be an intervention about moving to assisted living. The car's windows were so dark you couldn't see inside. Margaret caught a smell when Linda opened the door. Something familiar but wrong, like hearing your favorite song played in a different key. I'm not getting in that car until you tell me where we're going. David's shoulders sagged. For a second, he looked exactly like he had at 8 years old, when she'd caught him lying about breaking Harold's favorite mug. Mom, please, just this once, can you not ask a million questions? Questions keep you alive at my age. Linda made a sound that might have been a laugh or might have been a sob. Margaret couldn't tell which, and that scared her more than the mysterious car or David's weird behavior. She got in anyway, because what choice did she have? At 80, your options got pretty limited. The car smelled like leather and that cologne, Old Spice, maybe? It made her think of summer nights and promises that got broken by distance and time, but that was crazy. Her brain was probably just mixing up memories again, the way it did lately. Margaret could only see the driver's hands on the steering wheel. Working man's hands with calluses and a small crescent-shaped scar across the knuckles that made her heart do something weird and fluttery. "David, I swear to God, if you don't tell me what's happening right now." "Mom, stop." David's voice cracked like a 13-year-old's. "Just let me think." But he wasn't thinking, he was panicking. Margaret had seen that look before, the night Harold had his heart attack, when David was 15 and trying to be the man of the house, but still just a scared kid. The car pulled onto Lake Shore Drive, heading north, away from the city, away from everything familiar. "Are you taking me somewhere to die?" The question popped out before Margaret could stop it, but honestly, she was past the point of being polite about her own potential murder. David made a sound like he was choking. "What? No. God, Mom, no. Because if you are, I should probably mention I changed my will last month and left everything to the animal shelter." "You did what?" "Kidding." Margaret almost smiled. "But seriously, David, what the hell is going on?" David leaned forward toward the driver. His hands were shaking now, really shaking, and Margaret felt something cold settle in her stomach. "Take her out of town," David said quietly. "This is her last birthday." The words hit Margaret like a slap. Her last birthday. Her own son, the baby she'd rocked through colic and nightmares and teenage heartbreak, talking about her like she was already gone. "David James Thompson, you look at me right now." But David couldn't look at her. He was crying, actually crying, and Margaret felt the world tilt sideways. The driver's hands tightened on the wheel, and Margaret saw that scar again, that impossibly familiar scar that belonged to someone who'd been dead for 60 years. Her breath caught. No, that was impossible. People didn't come back from the dead, especially not to help your son with whatever this was. But she knew those hands. God help her, she knew those hands. Margaret pressed her face against the window, watching Chicago disappear like water down a drain. Her city, her whole life really, since she'd never lived anywhere else. Born on the south side, raised David on the north side, and now, what, dying somewhere in between? "You know what I remember about you when you were little?" she said. Because if this was it, if this was how it ended, she wasn't going out quiet. David was still crying, but he looked at her. "You were maybe 6, and Mrs. Patterson's cat got hit by a car. You found it in the alley, already dead, but you insisted we have a funeral. Made me help you dig a grave behind the building." Margaret's voice was steadier than she felt. "You cried for 3 days, wouldn't eat. I thought you were going to make yourself sick with grief over a cat that wasn't even yours. Mom, don't. And when you were 15 and your dad died, you tried so hard to be tough. Told me men don't cry, like Harold hadn't cried like a baby every time he watched Old Yeller." She reached over and touched David's hand. "But you're crying now." "I can't, we can't." David's words came out in gasps. Margaret studied the back of the driver's head. Gray hair, but thick. Shoulders that held themselves a certain way when he was tense. She'd traced those shoulders with her fingers in the summer of 1965, when she was 20 and stupid and thought love could conquer geography. The car turned off the highway onto some winding road that led through trees. Margaret had been this way before, a lifetime ago, when Jimmy Sullivan had borrowed his uncle's car and they'd driven out to the lake to watch the sunset and make promises they were too young to keep. Jimmy, who died in a car accident 3 months after he left for Oregon. Jimmy, whose sister had called to tell her there wasn't enough left to send home for burial. But that scar on the driver's hand. She'd traced that scar with her finger the night before he left, when they'd sat by this same lake and planned a future that died with him on a highway outside Milwaukee. Jimmy? The name came out as a whisper. The car swerved slightly, then straightened. David stared at her. "Mom, what did you just say?" But Margaret was staring at the rearview mirror, waiting for the driver to adjust it, waiting to see eyes that had haunted her dreams for 60 years. Blue eyes. Impossibly, heartbreakingly blue. When the car stopped in a clearing by the lake, and the driver slowly turned around, Margaret felt like she was falling through time. Jimmy Sullivan looked back at her, and 60 years collapsed into nothing. "Hey, Maggie." Same voice, deeper now, roughened by age, but the same voice that used to whisper her name in the dark when they were 20, and the world was full of possibility. Margaret couldn't breathe, couldn't think, could barely manage to whisper, "You're supposed to be dead." Jimmy's smile was sadder now, worn around the edges like an old photograph. "Yeah, well, reports of my death were greatly exaggerated. Your sister called me. Jenny called me and said you were gone. Said there was nothing left to." Margaret's voice broke. "Jenny thought I was dead. I thought I was dead. Spent 4 months in a hospital with no memory, no ID, nothing. By the time I figured out who I was, Jenny said you'd moved on, married, happy. She figured Jimmy Sullivan was better off staying buried." "Better off?" Margaret's voice came out strangled. "I cried for 6 months, couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. Harold found me passed out at work because I'd forgotten to eat for 3 days straight. David was looking between them like he'd stumbled into a movie halfway through. Mom, you knew him?" "Knew him?" Margaret laughed, but it sounded more like crying. "David, I was going to marry this man. We had plans. We were going to have kids and open a garage in Oregon and grow old together." Jimmy's hands were shaking on the steering wheel. "I spent 30 years looking for you, Maggie, but you were Margaret Thompson by then, and you looked happy in those pictures I found. You had David, you had Harold, you had a life. I didn't want to mess that up. So you let me think you were dead? I thought it was better." Margaret wanted to hit him. She wanted to scream at him for 60 years of wondering what if, 60 years of comparing every man to a ghost, 60 years of keeping his letters in a shoebox like some pathetic old woman. Instead, she said, "Why now? Why today?" Jimmy glanced at David, and something passed between them that Margaret didn't understand. "Because your son has a big mouth and an even bigger heart." Before Margaret could ask what that meant, car doors started slamming outside like a small army had arrived. She turned to see Sarah jogging toward them. When had her granddaughter gotten so tall? Followed by Linda with her arms full of what looked like party supplies, and Rose Martinez carrying a cake that was definitely not from the grocery store. "Surprise!" Sarah shouted, yanking Margaret's door open with the enthusiasm only 17-year-olds could muster. "Happy 80th, Grandma!" Margaret stared at the small crowd gathering around the car. Linda was stringing lights between trees like she'd done this before, and Rose was setting up a picnic table that had materialized from somewhere. "What in the Sam Hill is going on here?" David was grinning now, and it was the first real smile she'd seen from him in months. "Mom, remember those letters you kept in Dad's old shoebox? The ones you thought nobody knew about?" Margaret's face went hot. "You went through my private things?" "Linda was helping you sort stuff for the move to Sunset Manor, and we found them." David's eyes were bright. Return address said J. Sullivan, Oregon, so I got curious. Jimmy had climbed out of the car and was standing there looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. "Kid hired a private investigator. Took him 2 months to track me down to my ranch outside Portland." "Your ranch?" 40 acres and 12 horses. Never did open that garage." Jimmy shrugged. "Turns out I was better with animals than engines." Sarah bounced on her toes. "He's got pictures, Grandma, and he says maybe you could come visit sometime and see the horses." Margaret looked around at all the faces, David, who'd somehow orchestrated this whole thing, Linda, who was crying and hanging streamers at the same time, Sarah, who was practically vibrating with excitement, Rose, who was probably already planning to tell everyone in the building about this, and Jimmy, who looked exactly like the boy she'd fallen in love with. Just 60 years more weathered. "So when you said this was my last birthday?" "Last birthday alone," David said. "I thought maybe it was time you stopped spending them missing someone who wasn't actually dead." Margaret looked at Jimmy, and he looked back, and 60 years of questions hung in the air between them. "Well," she said finally, "this is either the best birthday surprise ever, or you've all lost your minds." "Can't it be both?" Sarah asked, and Margaret started laughing.